She laughed at the myths of human warriors, until she saw one fight HFY, a short sci-fi story. The first thing Veilsorn said when the intelligence report landed on her command table was nothing. She read it in silence. Then she read it again. Then she set it down with the deliberate care of someone placing a glass object near a table's edge, and she began to laugh. It was not a small laugh. It rolled out of her like something she'd been saving for years, a full-body exhalation that made the three advisors standing at attention in the observation chamber take a single synchronized step backward. Her laughter was famous in the Keth fleet. It preceded decisions. 17 incursions, she said, when the sound had settled. 17 attempts by 6 different species to bring this world to heel. All 17 repulsed. She picked up the report and let it fall from her four-fingered hand. The photonic paper fluttered in the recycled air. And from that data, your recommendation is what exactly? Caution. Subcommander Drain kept his posture rigid. He was very good at rigid posture when Veilsorn was in this mood. The recommendation is thoroughness, Empress. Previous incursions were conducted by the Vreth, the Galshan, the Communion. She waved a hand dismissively. Children playing at conquest. She moved around the table, and the holographic projection of the blue-green planet rotated slowly at its center, clouds smearing across its oceans in pale ribbons. We are the Keth. We have subdued 43 worlds. We have broken species that bent gravity to their will. She stopped moving. These are animals that have not yet achieved faster-than-light travel. They use chemical combustion to leave their atmosphere. Yes, Empress. They have had nuclear weapons for less than one of their centuries, and have, somehow, not yet used them on each other to extinction. That is also accurate. She turned back to the planet. Her eyes were the pale silver of old moons, and they did not blink often. What I find most amusing, she said, and the amusement in her voice was genuine, almost warm, is this. She touched the report again, summoning the specific passage to a hovering light display. The mythology. They tell stories to their children, mind you, to their young, about what they call warriors, heroes, people who face impossible odds and do not yield. The display showed primitive pictographic records, ancient carvings, texts in dead languages. Every one of their civilizations, independent of each other, thousands of years apart, develops the same archetype, the stubborn one, the one who keeps fighting when all sense has fled. She shook her head. They built temples to this idea, religions. It is a noted cultural fixture, Drain agreed carefully. It is a coping mechanism, Veilsorn said. Stories told to quiet frightened children in the dark. They have no mechanism for understanding how small they are in the universe, so they invented mythology to feel less so. She turned away from the planet completely. Prepare the fleet. 3 orbital bombardment ships, 1 ground presence division, standard extraction protocols for resource harvest. We begin the approach in 4 cycles. She was already walking toward the chamber's far door. And send an observer, someone with analytical temperament. I want a full account of what this mythology looks like when it meets reality. I want the documentation to be thorough. She paused at the threshold and looked back at the spinning planet one last time. I want to be able to read it aloud at functions. She left without waiting for acknowledgement. Her laughter echoed in the corridor for a long time afterward. Observer third-rank Saris had never been to a contested world during an active suppression. She had studied 18 of them in the archives. She had written her certification thesis on the psychological response patterns of pre-FTL civilizations to first contact under hostile conditions. She had received the second highest marks in her cohort and had been told by her instructor that she possessed a gift for analytical distance, the ability to observe suffering without being diminished by it, which was the essential quality of a good observer. She stood now in the transport bay of the suppression vessel, unwavering, her recording apparatus secured to her left forearm, her atmospheric suit sealed to her jaw, and she tried to summon that analytical distance as the planet filled the bay's forward screen. It was larger than it looked in the archives. The oceans were the color of something she did not have a direct word for in Keth, a blue so dense it seemed to have weight. The land masses were green and brown and veined with silver where rivers ran. The single large moon hung at its upper left hemisphere like a pale watching eye. "It's beautiful," said the technician securing her drop harness. Sarah said nothing, analytical distance. The descent was 40 minutes of controlled violence. Her pod hit the upper atmosphere and everything became noise and heat, and the screaming of ablative shielding doing its job. The targeting system had selected a landing coordinate in the planet's largest island nation, Japan, the archives said, the word feeling strange in Keth phonetics. The Keth had chosen Japan specifically because a previous incursion 2 years prior had mapped its infrastructure in detail. Its underground transit networks, its communication arrays, its military staging areas. The ground presence would land at multiple points simultaneously. Japan would be one of 7 anchor zones. Her pod hit the ground in a park. There was a fountain. The fountain was still running. She climbed out into the warm air of a Tokyo evening, and the first thing she registered was sound. She had expected silence or screaming. Instead, there was something more complicated, a layered acoustic environment of distant concussive impacts, sirens, the specific frequency of what the archives called emergency broadcast systems, and underneath all of it, incongruously, birdsong. Something small and unseen was still singing in a tree at the park's edge. It had not gotten the signal that the world had ended. The sky to the northwest was orange and black, not sunset. Something was burning. Sarah activated her recording apparatus and began to walk. She found the first humans 12 minutes later, and her first reaction, which she recorded dutifully as a professional, was that they were smaller than the archives suggested. Not physically smaller. The measurements were accurate, but somehow the expectation of myth had inflated them in her imagination, and the reality was these. A group of approximately 20 individuals in the dark green uniforms of the military organization designated JSDF, moving in disciplined formation down a wide commercial street, their faces drawn tight with the specific expression that Saris had learned to recognize in archive footage as controlled fear. They were moving toward the sounds, toward the orange sky. At their head was a man who looked old enough to be at the end of whatever career structure this civilization used. He was compact, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been organized by many years into something permanently arranged for difficulty. He was moving without urgency, not slowly, but with the rhythm of someone who had decided on a pace and intended to keep it regardless of what asked him to deviate. A young soldier jogged up beside him. Even from Saris's position at the mouth of an adjacent alley, she could see the soldier's hands were shaking. She increased the sensitivity of her audio capture. 3 of the things in the transit station, Colonel. Sergeant Park says they've got something like a plasma cutter built into their chassis, and the walls are just. I heard Sergeant Park's report. The old man's voice was a low register, worn to smoothness. He did not slow. What I need from you right now is your right hand on your weapon and your left hand carrying your end of the charge pack. Can you do that? A beat. Yes, sir. Then that's what we're doing. He glanced sideways and the gesture was so quick that Saris almost missed it, a brief look at the young soldier's face, not checking his posture or his equipment but looking at him, actually seeing him. You've done hard things before, the old man said quietly. This is a hard thing, that's all it is. The young soldier's hand stopped shaking. Not because the fear had gone, Saris's instrument cluster confirmed elevated stress markers in the boy's gait and respiratory pattern, but because something else had entered the equation. Something she filed under behavioral notation without yet having a word for it. The formation turned a corner and was gone. Sarah stood in the alley for a moment. She reviewed the recording. She watched the old man's sideways glance again, and the 17-second interval between the glance and the young soldier's hand steadying. She categorized it under inter-unit cohesion mechanisms and moved on. The transit station was 3 blocks south, and Saris reached its entrance at the same moment as something she had only ever seen in archive footage. A Keth exterminator drone. It emerged from the station's underground stairwell in the lurching, deliberate way that all exterminator units moved, the heavy armored chassis rolling on its repulsion field, the single targeting photoreceptor scanning in smooth arcs, the twin energy projectors already hot and humming. The housing was scorched. Something had hit it recently. Behind it from the underground came a sound she recognized, the 3-beat tone of a human emergency alarm, and below that, the sharp crack of human chemical propellant weapons. Gunfire. Someone was still down there, still engaging. The exterminator cleared the stairs and paused in its threat assessment, its targeting photoreceptor swinging east toward a cluster of fleeing civilians, and then Saris held absolutely still, directly across her. The photoreceptor registered her atmospheric suit's Keth transponder and moved on. Observer protocols. She was not a target. She watched it turn its attention back south. Then something came up the stairs behind it. The young woman was perhaps 25 years old by the archival aging tables. She wore the gray uniform of what Saris's database identified as a Japanese Defense Force Analytical Division, not a combat unit. She was bleeding from a cut above her left eye, which she had ignored. In her right hand she was carrying a section of steel reinforcement rod, approximately 90 centimeters long, torn from something underground. Her left hand was pressed against the wall for stability. Her left knee was not bending correctly. She was injured. She should not have been walking. She was walking. The exterminator registered the movement. The targeting photoreceptor swung back. Saris's instrument cluster flagged this as a termination event. A lightly armed human in damaged physical condition facing a Keth war drone at close range. The cluster automatically calculated outcome probabilities with the efficiency of a machine designed for data, and the probability of the human's survival was displayed in Saris's peripheral vision in the calm, unambiguous language of statistics. The young woman looked at the exterminator. The exterminator looked at her. Then she set her feet, adjusted her grip on the section of steel rod, and the expression on her face changed. It was not the expression of defiance that the mythology promised, not the raised chin and the burning eyes and the grand gesture. It was quieter than that and somehow worse. It was the expression of someone who had already decided. The calculation was done. The fear was there, plainly visible, and it had simply been set aside like a piece of equipment she didn't currently need. "Yeah," she said in Japanese, which Saris's translation sweet rendered in flat Keth phonetics. "Come on, then." The exterminator fired. She was already moving. Not gracefully, the injured knee made it ugly, a lurching sideways drop that put her behind the concrete balustrade at the stair's edge. The energy bolt vaporized the section of balustrade directly above her head. Concrete dust rained down. She didn't stay behind cover. That was the thing Saris would review 14 times in the next 3 hours, trying to understand the tactical logic. Cover, she knew, was where you waited for rescue or extraction. Cover was the terminus of retreat. But this woman came around the left side of the balustrade at a dead run, or the closest approximation of a dead run that an injured knee would allow, and she hit the exterminator's left sensor cluster with the steel rod with both hands and everything she had. The Keth exterminator was not designed for close engagement. It was designed for distances between 5 and 500 meters. Inside 1 meter, the energy projectors could not depress to a usable angle. Its chassis could turn, but turning took 0.8 seconds. The young woman was already at its right flank before the photoreceptor could track, and she hit the sensor cluster again, and again, and the third blow opened a crack in the housing that the drone's self-repair systems immediately began trying to seal. The drone slammed its chassis sideways, a movement like a physical shrug, and the impact sent the woman tumbling. She hit the pavement hard and did not get up immediately. She lay there for 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than Saris's probability calculations had allotted her at this stage of the encounter. Then she got up. Her left hand was clutching the steel rod. Her right was pressed against the ground. She pushed. She stood. The injured knee buckled once and she caught herself with a hand on the stairwell railing and she stood. The exterminator turned to face her. From the transit station entrance behind her, 3 JSDF soldiers appeared at a run, and they had brought something that was not a chemical propellant weapon. A jury-rigged device Saris's database did not have a classification for, assembled from components she could identify as power cell housing, a transit infrastructure generator chassis, and what appeared to be a targeting module cannibalized from a different type of Keth equipment entirely. Someone had reverse-engineered a Keth power cell in the time available, which by Saris's calculation was approximately 37 minutes since the first drone had entered this district. They fired it. The exterminator's repulsion field collapsed. Without the field, the drone's chassis was simply a very heavy piece of machinery with no locomotion, and it settled onto the pavement with a sound like a small building falling down and did not move again. Saris stood at the mouth of the alley. She was aware that she had been holding her breath for some portion of the last 4 minutes. She was also aware that this was not an analytical observer behavior. She reviewed her recordings. The young woman with the steel rod was sitting on the pavement now with her back against the dead drone's housing while one of the soldiers wrapped her head wound. She was talking, gesturing at the jury-rigged device, clearly explaining something, her good hand drawing shapes in the air. Technical debrief, Saris noted, immediately post-engagement. While still bleeding. She added a note to her file, review probability models. Current parameters may be incomplete. Saris found Sergeant Adiz Akefer by following the stillness. Everything else in this district was noise and movement. JSDF units repositioning, civilian evacuation columns pressing south, the distant rhythmic impacts of the Keth orbital suppression bombardment working its way across the industrial zones to the north. Against all of this, the stillness was visible the way a stone is visible in moving water. Sergeant Akefer was sitting on an overturned equipment crate outside what Saris's database identified as a communications relay station, drinking from a metal container that steamed in the evening air. She was older than the colonel, perhaps, with a face that collected light in the lines around her eyes and mouth, the way aged wood collects grain. Her uniform bore the insignia of a unit that had served in 2 previous alien contact events. The previous incursions, which Veilsorn had dismissed as children's attempts at conquest. She had survived both. She was watching the sky to the north, where the bombardment was creating light shows that Saris's own optical processing registered as aesthetically striking even through the analytical partition. The sergeant watched these lights the way someone watches a weather system, interested, tracking, taking note of the pattern without being moved by it. A younger soldier, barely out of whatever training structure this culture used, barely old enough for the fear in his face to have settled into something he knew how to carry, came to a stop beside her at speed, breathing hard. Sergeant Akefer, command saying the 3 northern bridges are gone and there's a column of. Sit down, she said. Sergeant. Sit down, Corporal, not unkindly, with the certainty of someone for whom the instruction was obvious. You've been running for 40 minutes. Your decision-making degrades when you're running. Sit. He sat on the ground beside the crate ungainly because there was no second crate. He sat anyway. She held out the metal container. He looked at it. Tea, she said. My mother used to say that you make the best decisions in your life sitting down with something hot in your hands. My mother was a deeply practical woman. She shook the container slightly. The bridges are gone. The column is 3 kilometers north and moving at whatever pace it's moving. You have 30 seconds before you need to stand up and go tell the colonel those things. Drink." He drank. Saris, watching from the roof of an adjacent building, was aware of something shifting in her instrument cluster's data, not the numbers, but her relationship to the numbers. The probability readouts and stress response measurements and behavioral categorization tags all continued scrolling in her peripheral vision, and she was aware, at some remove, that she was not reading them anymore. She was watching the old woman and the young man, the tea steaming in the cooling air, the lights to the north. She realized with some alarm, being moved. This was not an analytical observer behavior. She made a note to review her instrument calibration. The Keth ground presence had established 3 anchor points in the metro district by nightfall, and from her position on a transit authority building's roof, Saris could see 2 of them. They were doing exactly what they were designed to do, with exactly the efficiency she expected. Perimeter establishment, communication suppression fields deployed, resource extraction teams beginning their initial survey. All textbook, all according to the 43-world playbook. The humans were also doing something. It was less visually organized, which she had initially logged as evidence of the disorganization she'd been briefed to expect. But she had now been watching for 6 hours, and she was revising that assessment. The disorganization was surface level. Underneath it, something else was operating, a kind of distributed intelligence that did not look like a command structure because it wasn't one. The colonel who talked to his soldiers' faces instead of their postures. The analyst with the steel rod who immediately debriefed her colleagues the moment the fight was over. The sergeant who made young men sit down before they ran. Each of them was not waiting for instructions. Each of them was operating with a completeness of purpose that didn't require the chain of command to function. Because the chain of command was apparently a habit rather than a dependency. She saw 3 separate instances in 2 hours of individuals making decisions that a Keth commander would have needed 3 advisory confirmations to authorize. She saw a civilian, not military, not special security, just a civilian with a communications background according to the lanyard still around his neck, splice himself into the JSDF communications relay and begin routing traffic around the Keth suppression fields using what appeared to be a combination of repurposed mobile communication nodes, and she was relatively certain, at least 2 consumer-grade entertainment broadcasting arrays. He had solved, in roughly 90 minutes, the exact communication suppression problem that the Keth communication warfare team had calculated would take a pre-FTL civilization approximately 4 days to work around. She sent a priority observation flag to the fleet and received, in return, a priority response from Sub-Commander Drain that read, "Continue observation. Empress notes these are isolated incidents. Confirm when pattern fails to hold." Saris looked at the message for a long time. She looked at the communication relay building, where the civilian was still working, routing around the suppression field with a facility that was starting to make the Keth communication warfare team look expensive. She looked at the 2 JSDF teams that she had now watched incorporate 3 different pieces of Keth equipment into their own operational frameworks in under 8 hours, each time with a speed that suggested they had been unconsciously preparing for this possibility, though they could not have known the specific equipment ahead of time. She looked at the probability readouts on her instrument cluster, which she had updated 3 times in the last 4 hours, and which still did not feel accurate. She sent a response to Drain. Pattern is not failing to hold. Pattern is intensifying. Recommend Empress review full observation data before proceeding with Phase 2 suppression. The response came back in 40 seconds. Empress says, "This is what 17 previous civilizations said. Proceed with Phase 2 in 12 hours. Document the capitulation for the archives." At hour 9, Saris witnessed something she did not have a classification for and was not sure she could create one. She had followed a JSDF signals unit to a transit authority substation 2 levels below street grade, and in the substation's main operations room, Colonel Hayashi, the old man, the one who looked at his soldiers' faces, was standing at a planning table with the civilian communications expert, Sergeant Akafor. The young analyst whose name Saris had by now learned from radio intercepts was Kira Tanaka, and 6 others. Kira's head wound had been properly dressed. She was still carrying the steel rod. She had not put it down once. They were looking at a schematic that Saris identified, after a moment of processing, as a Keth Fleet communication architecture. Someone had mapped it, not from pre-invasion intelligence, which they could not have had, but from 9 hours of combat observation and signals intercept. They had reverse-engineered a Keth Fleet communication map in 9 hours using captured equipment, civilian-grade sensors, and what appeared to be a significant amount of creative speculation that turned out, from Saris's vantage, to be mostly correct. The civilian, whose name Saris had logged as Specialist Ren, not Japanese, a foreign national secondment of some kind, very young, with the distracted energy of someone whose mind runs faster than their surroundings, was talking rapidly, sketching on the schematic with a stylus. The suppression field runs on the same carrier frequency as their intrafleet positioning system, he was saying, the words coming out at the pace of someone who learned early that the idea evaporates if you don't speak it immediately. They're broadcasting it continuously because they need it to be continuous. If the field drops for more than 3 seconds, the navigation mesh desyncs. That's the lever. That's the thing. He looked up from the schematic. If we push a strong enough signal on that frequency from below their expected signal range from the transit system's existing antenna array, which is already down here, already pointing up, we don't jam it. We make it think it's talking to itself. Feedback loop. Every ship in suppression mode within range tries to self-correct against its own signal. The field doesn't drop. It tears. Silence in the room. How long would that hold, the colonel? Long enough. Maybe 12 minutes. Maybe 15. The self-correction algorithm would figure it out eventually, but Ren shrugged with the specific eloquence of someone who lives in the gap between perfect solutions and available ones. 15 minutes of torn suppression field is a 15-minute window. For what? This was Kira, and the way she asked it was not skeptical. She already knew, Saris thought. She was just making the colonel say it out loud, confirming the architecture. The colonel looked at the schematic. He looked at it the way Sergeant Akafor had looked at the burning sky to the north, taking note of the pattern without being moved by it. Then he looked up. For everything coordinated to happen at once, he said. Sarah sent a second priority observation flag. She attached the full schematic reconstruction, the acoustic recording of the operational planning session, and her own annotated analysis, which took her 23 minutes to write and which she was aware, as she wrote it, was the most agitated piece of professional documentation she had ever produced. The response from Drain came in 30 seconds. Empress says, interesting. Let them try. Document the failure. Saris looked at the message. She looked at the substation room below her, where the colonel was now moving, and the others were moving, and the specific quality of that movement was something she had been watching all day and had finally found a classification for. It was not urgency. It was not desperation. It was the movement of people who have decided what they are going to do and no longer have any excess energy to spend on doubt. She looked at her probability readouts, which she had stopped trusting 3 hours ago and had not yet updated because she was not sure her models contained the right variables. She sent a third message, not to Drain, directly to the Empress's observation queue. I have been here 11 hours. I came to document the failure of the mythology. I cannot document what I am not observing. Recommend immediate reassessment of Phase 2 timeline. No response. The signal went up at 3:40 local time, and Saris was on the Transit Authority building's roof when it did. because she had been there for 4 hours without moving, and she had not moved because she was watching and could not stop. It came from 7 points simultaneously. 7 separate transit system antenna arrays, repurposed in the space of one operational night, each pushing signal on the Keth fleet positioning frequency, with the specific phase variance that Specialist Wren had calculated from 9 hours of eavesdropping on enemy communications. 7 arrays that did not individually have the power to cause the feedback loop, but 7 together, at the precise coordinated moment, reached the threshold. Saris watched the suppression field tear. It was not a visual phenomenon exactly. The suppression field itself was invisible, but the effects of its failure were not. The navigation-linked equipment in both ground presence anchor points she could observe simultaneously began its self-correction cycle, and for 11 seconds the suppression effect wavered. And in those 11 seconds, the JSDF signals units that had been staging in the transit tunnels all night lit up their communication arrays and established contact with every other human unit in the Metro District simultaneously. And the information that moved in those 11 seconds was not confused or redundant or lost in the chaos of command hierarchy. It moved like something that had been cued and waiting, like the breath before speech, because it had been. 9 hours of coordination in 11 seconds of open window. Then the Keth self-correction algorithm caught the feedback loop and the suppression field sealed. But the coordination had happened. All across the Metro District, the simultaneous operations that the coordination enabled began. Sarah stood on the roof and watched a pre-FTL civilization, in the early hours of their first morning of alien invasion, systematically dismantle 3 anchor points that had been established by a species that had done this 43 times before, using equipment that was not theirs, in a time frame that her best probability models had calculated was physically insufficient, with a casualty profile that she kept rerunning because the numbers kept coming out wrong. She watched Kira Tanaka, whose left knee still did not bend correctly, lead a 6-person unit through the transit system's lower levels into the base of Anchor Point 2's communication tower, and she watched them place devices at the tower's load-bearing joints that were not explosive ordnance. Humans had that, certainly, but they had something more elegant here, something that turned the tower's own resonance frequencies against its structure. Specialist Wren's work again, she suspected. 11 minutes later the tower came down not explosively, but progressively, section by section, the way a very tall thing falls when the decision to fall has been made from the inside. She watched Sergeant Ockhaffer, who did not run anywhere, who walked at the pace of someone who had calculated that the pace of walking was sufficient, direct 3 separate civilian evacuation routes simultaneously using nothing but a handheld communication device, and the authority of someone who had decided that the people in her general proximity would not be lost today. She watched the colonel take a section of Keth perimeter barrier, a piece of alien infrastructure that outmassed him by perhaps 400%, and use it as cover for a flanking movement so simple it took Saris a moment to understand why it worked, and then she understood. It worked because the Keth ground presence didn't expect it, not because the tactic was sophisticated. Because the ground presence's threat assessment programming had categorized the barrier as impassable cover rather than usable equipment, and the colonel had not made the same assumption. He had looked at the alien barrier and thought, what can I do with this? Saris had seen that thought process repeated in variant forms 17 times in 12 hours. Every time a human looked at a piece of Keth equipment, there was a beat, not long, sometimes less than a second, in which they were obviously not asking, what is this, but what can I do with this? The translation was so automatic, so reflexive, that she was not sure the humans themselves were conscious of it. 43 worlds, 43 species, none of them had done that. None of them had looked at the invader's equipment and immediately begun calculating its uses. Saris filed her final observation report at 6:12 local time, as the sun came up over a city that was, by most measurable metrics, still standing. She sent it to Drain. She sent it to the Empress's direct observation queue. She flagged it at every priority level available to an observer third rank, and then created a custom priority flag and sent it at that level too, because the standard levels did not seem adequate. The report was longer than any observer report in the Keth archives. She was aware of this. She wrote it anyway. It began, Empress Veilsorn, I was sent to document the failure of a mythology. I must report that after 14 hours of direct observation, I cannot confirm failure. I can confirm the following asterisk. The mythology is not mythology. What this civilization tells its children in stories about warriors, about people who face impossible odds and do not yield, who pick up whatever is in reach and use it, who look at each other's faces instead of each other's statistics, who sit down and drink tea before terrible things and then stand up and do the terrible things. This is not a coping mechanism. It is not a story told to quiet fear. It is documentation. They have been documenting, across independent civilizations spanning thousands of years, a behavioral profile. They have been telling each other reliably, accurately, this is what we are. I have watched them be what they are for 14 hours. I do not believe another 14 hours will produce different data. I recommend immediate withdrawal from the metro anchor points and a full strategic reassessment. The 43 World Playbook was written for species that respond to the arrival of a superior force with the behavioral options of the spectrum: panic, surrender, organize and fail, organize and negotiate. This species is using a fifth option that our playbook does not contain a category for. I am provisionally naming it refuse and adapt. The refuse is not stubbornness in the simple sense. It is not the absence of fear. I have measured their fear responses throughout this observation period, and they are, by any physiological standard, afraid. The fear is present and they are moving through it, not around it. The adapt is not intelligence in the standard sense. It is something faster and stranger, a reflexive translational instinct that looks at any object, any system, any constraint, and asks first what it can become rather than what it is. Together, these produce an adversary that our standard suppression models cannot account for, because our models assume that sufficiently overwhelming force produces capitulation, and what I have observed is that sufficiently overwhelming force produces, in this species, a specific and highly dangerous form of clarity. I am attaching 14 hours of recording. I am flagging timestamp 02-14-33 in particular. This is the moment Kira Tanaka stood up from the pavement after the exterminator impact. I have reviewed this timestamp 41 times. I do not have adequate language to explain what it shows. I am hoping that reviewing it directly will be adequate. Respectfully submitted asterisk. Observer 3rd rank Ceres. Observation record, Earth, Japan, Metropolitan Tokyo. Hour 1 through hour 14 asterisk. The response came in 4 hours. Not from Drain. From Veilsorn herself, which had not happened in Ceres's career, not once, not to an observer 3rd rank in the field. It was short, 2 lines. Send the full recording archive, all 14 hours. Hold position, do not reveal yourself. Continue observation. Stories.Reddit standing on the Transit Authority building's roof in the early morning light, looking out over a city that smelled of smoke and wet concrete, and the indefinable mineral smell of alien equipment cooling where it had fallen. Somewhere below in the transit system, she could hear human voices, not alarmed voices, not military voices, the voices of civilians coming back to spaces that had been cleared, checking on things, already beginning the enumeration of what needed repair. A bird was singing again, the same frequency as last night, she thought, maybe the same bird. She reviewed Veilsorn's message again. She thought about the Empress's laugh, which she had heard before departure, The full-body laugh of someone who had already decided, who found the data amusing, who was comfortable in the certainty of 43 worlds and a playbook that had never yet failed. She thought about the colonel's sideways glance at his soldier's face. She thought about the tea steaming in Sergeant Okafor's hand. She thought about Kira Tanaka at timestamp 02-14-33, pushing up from the pavement, her left hand clutching the steel rod, her right pressed to the ground, the knee buckling once and catching, the expression already arranged for whatever came next. She added a personal note to the bottom of her archived report. Not official, not for the fleet records, just for herself, in the way that her instructor had taught her to do when observation produced data that the frameworks did not yet accommodate. Note to self: I came here expecting to see a mythology fail. I watched it hold for 14 hours. I think I may have been studying the wrong question. The question was never whether this civilization was small. The question was what they do with the knowledge that they are. They already know. They have always known. It's in every story they ever told. They know, and they get up anyway. I don't think the 43-world playbook covers that. She sent the archive. She held position. She continued to observe. Above her, moving in the upper atmosphere at a velocity that suggested a course change rather than standard orbit, 3 Keth bombardment vessels altered their approach vectors. They did not descend. For the first time in 43 worlds of conquest, the fleet held. Below in the city, the birds kept singing.